The first time Grace Hadley heard a stranger on her land. She already had her rifle aimed at the sound before his boots had finished crunching through the dry creek bed that marked the eastern boundary of the Hadley spread. It was the autumn of 1883, and the land around Clover Creek, Texas, was doing what it always did in October, drying out and going golden and stubborn, the way Grace herself had learned to be after 3 years of widowhood, after 3 years of running 400 acres of scrub and pasture without a single hired hand she could actually trust. The air smelled of cedar and dust, and the faint sweetness of mesquite smoke drifting from her chimney. And beneath all of that, beneath everything she had trained herself to notice, she could smell a horse that had been ridden too hard and too long without proper water. She stood very still at the edge of the porch, one hand resting on the rough-hewn post her late husband Robert had cut and sanded himself, the other cradling the Winchester with the comfortable familiarity of an old friendship. Her dark hair was pinned back loosely, a few strands pulled free by the afternoon wind, and her eyes, gray and still and luminous as creek water, were open and aimed toward the sound, the way they always were. People who did not know Grace Hadley assumed she could see. Her eyes looked like seeing eyes. They moved, they tracked sounds, they widened and narrowed with emotion. They just did not process light. Had not since a fever took her vision when she was 7 years old, in 1863, when the whole of the South was burning anyway, and one small girl going blind was barely worth a letter home. She was 27 now, and she had spent 20 years learning the world without her eyes, which meant she had spent 20 years learning the world in a way most people never bothered to. The footsteps stopped. The horse let out a low, exhausted sound, somewhere between a whinny and a sigh, and Grace felt a small pull of pity for the animal even as she kept the rifle level. "I can hear you breathing," she said. Her voice was calm and unhurried. "And I can hear that horse suffering. So you are going to tell me who you are and what you want, and then I am going to decide whether to shoot you or not." There was a pause, the kind of pause that told her more than words would have. It was not the pause of a man calculating a lie. It was the pause of a man who was genuinely startled, maybe a little embarrassed, and possibly too exhausted to do anything clever. "Ma'am," a voice said. It was low and rough-edged, like a man who spent most of his time outdoors and not a lot of time making polished conversation. "My name is Peter Trask. I am not here to cause trouble. I am lost is what I am. I have been riding for 2 days, and I do not know this country, and my horse is near done, and I saw the smoke from your chimney, and I thought—" "You thought what?" Grace said. "That you would ride onto a woman's land uninvited and hope for the best." Another pause. She heard the leather creak as he shifted in the saddle. "I did not know it was a woman's land," he said, and then she heard him realize immediately how that sounded, because he added quickly, "Not that it matters. What I mean to say is that I would not have come onto any person's land without asking, only I did not see a gate or a fence line, and my fence line is marked by the creek," Grace said. "The one you rode through." "I see," said Peter Trask. He sounded genuinely mortified. "I apologize, ma'am. I truly do. I will water my horse from your creek if you will permit it, and then I will be on my way." Grace held the rifle a moment longer. She was doing what she always did, listening beneath the words, listening to the cadence of the breathing, the small involuntary sounds that told her whether a man was frightened or angry or lying or simply beaten down. This man sounded beaten down. He sounded like a person at the very end of the rope he had been holding onto, too proud to say so plainly, trying to make polite conversation when what he probably needed was water and a place to sit and possibly a meal. She lowered the rifle. "Bring the horse to the trough on the north side of the house," she said. "There is a water pump. The bucket is already out. You can water the both of you." She heard the soft exhale of relief he was trying to hide, and she turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind her as an invitation that was not quite an invitation, the kind of conditional welcome she had learned to offer carefully and sparingly since Robert died. She stood at the kitchen window, which looked out over the yard, and she listened to the sound of the man dismounting. He did it carefully, like a man with sore legs, and the patient, stumbling walk of the horse toward the trough, and the metallic clank of the pump handle being worked, and the rush and splash of well water. She heard the horse drink with that particular desperation of an animal that has been without enough water for 2 long, great sucking gulps, and she heard the man drink too, directly from the pump by the sound of it, no pretense of manners, just honest thirst. She put the kettle on. She was not entirely sure why she put the kettle on. She told herself it was already the hour when she made coffee anyway, which was true. She told herself she would not necessarily offer any to the stranger, which was less true. She moved through her kitchen the way she moved through every room in her house, with the complete and unhesitating confidence of someone who has memorized every inch of a space by touch and sound and smell, who knows that the third floorboard from the stove creaks, and that the cabinet door swings too far left if you do not catch it, who has built an entire geography in the mind that functions just as well as vision for the purpose of living. Outside, she heard the man settle onto the edge of the trough, and she heard the specific quality of the silence that meant he was looking at the property. She wondered what he was seeing. She knew what was there. The house, solid 2-room limestone construction Robert had built in 1877, before he married her, before he knew her well enough to understand that she would modify every inch of it with rope guides and notched counters, and a system of small bells at every gate and door that had made him laugh the first time he saw it, and then made him cry a little the second time, when he understood how completely and practically she had adapted her world. The barn, 40 feet north, rebuilt partially after a lightning strike in 1881. The chicken coop. The kitchen garden, still holding the last of the autumn squash. The pasture beyond, where her 8 longhorn cattle and 3 horses stood in the golden afternoon light. She heard the man say something to his horse, not words, just sounds, the kind of murmured reassurance you give an animal when you are also reassuring yourself, and something in her chest shifted the way things shifted sometimes when she was paying attention, and a person revealed themselves without knowing it. She put 2 cups on the counter. When she heard him on the porch, she called out, "There is coffee if you want it. Come in and sit down." He came in. She heard the specific change in sound that told her he was crossing the threshold from outdoors to indoors, the way ambient noise shifted slightly, and she heard him take off his hat because she heard the rustling and then a softness in the sound of his voice when he said, "Thank you, ma'am. That is very kind." She poured the coffee without turning around. She heard him settle into the chair at the kitchen table, Robert's chair, the one on the left, because the chair on the right was still hers and she had not moved it in 3 years, and she brought both cups to the table and sat down across from him. "Grace Hadley," she said, because it seemed like the thing to say. "Peter Trask," he said again, and his voice was different now that he was inside and no longer in the emergency of exhaustion and thirst. It was younger than she had expected. Not a boy's voice, but not an old man's either. Something in the middle, something honest. "Where are you trying to get to?" she asked. "Fort Stockton," he said. "I have a job waiting there, a cattle operation. But I came in from the north and I got turned around somewhere around the Pecos, and I have been riding in circles, I think, for 2 days. Grace wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She knew this land. She knew it better than any surveyor's map because she had walked every inch of it by foot, had counted her steps to every water source and fence post and rock formation, had built in her mind a map so detailed that she could tell you the exact distance from her front door to the dry wash 3 miles east where the rattlesnakes denned in winter, or the precise location of the old Comanche trail that cut diagonally across the southwest corner of her property. The Comanche had stopped using that trail a decade ago, pushed west and then onto reservations, their world carved away with the same systematic cruelty that the federal government had been applying with increasing efficiency since the end of the war. She knew that trail because old Samuel, one of the last of the Comanche men who had traded peacefully with the settlers in Clover Creek before the reservation period, had told her about it years ago, had described the land to her in terms she could understand because he had understood something about finding your way by feel and memory and attention rather than by sight. She thought about Fort Stockton. She thought about the route. She thought about the man sitting across from her, drinking her coffee with both hands around the cup in exactly the same way she held hers, which she had not expected. "You are about 40 miles northeast of Fort Stockton," she said, "if you know the country." "I do not know the country," Peter said. "That is the problem." "I know," she said. "I know that." He was quiet. Then he said carefully, "How do you, if you do not mind my asking, how do I know the land so well?" she said. "I was going to ask something else," he said. "I was going to ask how long you have lived here, but yes, also that." "Since 1879, she said. "I came here with my husband. He died in 1880. "I am sorry," Peter said, and she heard that he meant it. "So am I," she said. "As for knowing the land, I have walked it, every part of it, I have memorized it." There was a pause. She heard him try to figure out how to say something. She waited because she was patient and because she had spent her entire life waiting for people to arrive at the thing they were actually trying to say. "Are you, ma'am, I do not want to pry, but are you—" He stopped. Started again. "I noticed that you didn't when you were on the porch. You were looking toward me, but I wasn't sure if—" "I am blind," Grace said simply. "I have been since I was 7. I find it is more efficient to say it plainly." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. She had learned to categorize them. There was the silence of discomfort, which she disliked. There was the silence of pity, which she actively resented. There was the silence of calculation, which made her reach for the rifle again. And then there was this one, the silence of someone genuinely rearranging their understanding of the situation, not with horror or condescension, but with a kind of sincere recalibration. "And you run this place alone," he said. "I do," she said. "And you aimed that rifle at me from the porch." "I did." Another small silence, and then, unexpected, Peter Trask laughed, a brief, warm sound, not mocking, not patronizing, but the genuine laughter of someone who recognizes that they have badly underestimated something and finds it more delightful than humbling. "Ma'am," he said, "I came onto your land thinking I needed help, and it turns out I had no idea what kind of place I was riding into." "No," Grace agreed. "You did not." He stayed for dinner. She had not intended to invite him to stay for dinner. She told herself later that it was practical. His horse needed rest. The light was going. It would have been foolish for him to ride out in unfamiliar country in the dark. These things were all true. They were not entirely the reason. The reason, if she was honest with herself, which she always tried to be, was that it had been a very long time since someone had sat at her kitchen table and talked to her as if she were simply a person rather than a problem to be managed or a curiosity to be observed or a widow to be pitied or, worst of all, a dependent to be rescued. Peter Trask talked to her the way she imagined people talked to each other when they had not yet decided anything about each other, when everything was still open. He told her he was 31, from Kansas originally, had been moving south and west for the past 6 years following cattle work as it came. He had worked drives up to Abilene in the late 70s, had spent 2 years on a ranch in New Mexico, and had heard that the operation at Fort Stockton was looking for experienced men who could handle both cattle and horses. He had a quiet pride in his work that she liked, the kind that came not from vanity but from genuinely caring about doing things right. She told him about the ranch, more than she had intended to. She told him about Robert, who had been a good man, a kind man, a man who had married her knowing she was blind and treated that fact the way he treated weather, as a condition of life to be adapted to and worked around, not as a tragedy or a limitation, but simply as one of the features of their shared landscape. He had died of a fever fast, the way fevers took people in those years in that country before you had time to prepare. She told Peter about running the ranch after Robert died, about the neighbors who had come to tell her gently that she would have to sell, about the bank man from Clover Creek who had ridden out to explain in careful, slow words, as if she were both blind and stupid, that a woman on her own could not manage, let alone a blind woman. She told him about refusing to sell. She told him about the first year, which had been the hardest year of her life, in some ways worse than going blind had been, because at least when she lost her sight she had had her family around her. That year she had been entirely alone, learning a new version of everything. 3 longhorn cattle became 8, she said. 3 horses became 5 when the roan had a foal, and then 6 when I bought the bay from Ezra Tanner down in Clover Creek. The kitchen garden feeds me through summer and I put up enough to last winter. I trade eggs in town. I am doing fine. You are clearly doing more than fine, Peter said. There was something in his voice when he said it, not admiration exactly, or not just admiration, something warmer and less organized, like a feeling that had arrived before the person had decided what to do with it. She felt it, and she looked down at her empty coffee cup, and she cleared her throat. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "Your horse needs the rest and it would be foolish to ride out tonight. In the morning I will explain the route to you." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That is very generous. Thank you, Mrs. Hadley." "Grace," she said. She was not sure why she said it. "Thank you, Grace," he said. She lay awake that night in the limestone house, listening to the wind and the cattle and the small domestic sounds of the night, and she thought about the quality of her name in his voice, and felt a distant, inconvenient warmth that she told herself she was imagining. She was not imagining it. In the morning she was up before dawn, the way she always was, moving through the kitchen with the efficient confidence of a person who has never needed light to begin her day. She was already at the stove when she heard the barn door open and his footsteps cross the yard, different from last night now that the horse had been rested and his own body had recovered some of its energy. His steps were longer, more certain. He came to the door and said, "Good morning." "Good morning," she said. "Sit down." "There are eggs." He sat, she cooked. She was aware of him watching her. She was always aware of being watched. It was something you developed a sensitivity to when you could not see, the weight of another person's attention, the specific direction of it. His attention felt different from most people's. Most people watched her moving through her kitchen with that particular combination of fascination and faint anxiety, waiting for her to bump into something or mistake the salt for the sugar. His attention was quieter. It felt more like the way you watch someone do something they are very good at. She scrambled the eggs with dried pepper and the last of the green onions from the garden, and put a plate in front of him and one in front of herself, and they ate. And the morning came through the east window in the way she had always imagined it must, warm and golden, she thought, judging by the way it raised the temperature against her left cheek. And neither of them talked much, which she found she did not mind. After breakfast he helped her clear the dishes, which surprised her, and then she stood on the porch and began to describe the route to Fort Stockton. She told him in the way she had always described landscape to herself and others, not by sight, not by how things looked, but by texture and sound and smell and the physical reality of terrain. She told him that 4 miles south he would find a dry wash with a specific smell of sulfur from the spring that ran beneath it in wet years, and that he should follow that wash west for about 2 miles until it bent sharply south, and that the bend was marked by a group of 3 large limestone boulders that sat on the western bank, and that the middle one had a split top you could feel clearly when you ran your hand across it. She told him about the ridge line that would appear on his right about 6 miles on, and she described the exact sound the wind made coming through the notch in that ridge when it was blowing from the south, which it was today. She told him about the cattle track that ran along the base of the ridge, old track, maybe 10 years old now, worn into the hard caliche soil by a drive someone had run through this country in the early 70s, and that if he followed that track south-southwest, he would come to a settlement called Dry Wells in about 12 miles where he could ask anyone for the road to Fort Stockton, which from there was a straight run of another 20 miles on a road that was actually a road. She stopped talking. The description had taken several minutes, and she had given it without notes and without hesitation, every landmark placed in sequence with the precision of someone reading from an internal map. She heard Peter exhale slowly. "Grace," he said. "Yes. That is the most detailed description of an unknown route I have ever heard, more detailed than most trail maps I have seen." "I have walked most of it," she said. "I have ridden the rest." "You ride," he said. He caught himself immediately. "I am sorry that was—" "Yes, I ride," she said, not unkindly. "I have a good horse who knows my voice. We have been over this country together a great many times." He was quiet for a moment, and she heard something in that quiet that she recognized, though she had not heard it directed at herself in a very long time. It was the sound of someone becoming reluctant to leave. "I should be going," he said. "You should," she agreed. He went to saddle his horse, and she stood on the porch with one hand on the post, and she listened to the leather and the buckles and the horse's quiet acceptance of being prepared for travel. She heard him walk the horse around to the front of the house. She heard him stop at the base of the porch steps. Would it be all right if I came back through this way?" he said. "On the return, when the job is settled." Grace considered this. She was a woman who had learned to consider things carefully, who had learned that quick decisions made on feeling alone could lead you down routes with no good landmarks, no way back. "Fort Stockton is south," she said. "There is no particular return route that would bring you through here." "No," he said. "There is not, I know that." A long pause. The wind moved through the dry grass. One of her chickens made its purposeful, dissatisfied sound from behind the coop. "Then come back through this way," Grace said. She heard the smile in his voice when he said, "Yes, ma'am." She listened until the hoofbeats faded south toward the dry wash she had told him about, until she could hear nothing but her own land in the morning air, and then she went back inside and stood in her kitchen for a moment with both hands flat on the cool surface of the counter, and she breathed. She had been alone for 3 years, and she had been content. She was not sure she was as content as she had thought. He came back in November. She heard him coming from a long way off because she knew the sound of her land the way a musician knows a piece they have played 1,000 times. Every bird, every shifting of wind in the cedar, the way the dry grass whispered, the way her cattle moved and sounded when they were merely grazing versus when something had their attention. She was in the south pasture checking the fence line when she heard a horse on the eastern approach, and she knew from the rhythm of the hoofbeats, a particular slightly favored step on the left front, that it was the same horse she had given water to 6 weeks ago. She was standing at the fence when he rode up. "You found your way back," she said. "I did," Peter said. He stopped the horse, and she heard him looking around, probably trying to determine how she had known it was him. "How did you? Your horse has a particular gait," she said. "Slightly irregular on the left front. He favors it mildly. You should have Ezra Tanner look at his shoes. Ezra is the farrier in Clover Creek, 3 miles due east on the main road." "He needs a new shoe," Peter said, a note of quiet wonder in his voice. "The left front. I noticed it this morning." "I noticed it in October," Grace said. He laughed that warm sound again, and then he swung down from the saddle with more ease than he had managed 6 weeks ago, rested, fed, in better shape, and came to stand near the fence. "The job is settled," he said. "I start at Fort Stockton in the spring. They need me here for the winter to help with some fence work and preparation, so I have some time." "Some time," Grace said. "I was hoping, that is, I thought perhaps you might need some help with the ranch over winter." She turned to face him, and she knew her gray eyes were aimed in his direction, which sometimes unnerved people. It did not seem to unnerve Peter. "I have managed without help for 3 years," she said. "I know you have," he said. That was not an insult. She thought about the fence post in the northwest corner that she had been meaning to replace since September. She thought about the barn roof, which had developed a slow leak after the October rains. She thought about the many things that 2 hands could do that one pair of hands struggled with, not because of her blindness, but simply because of physics and the nature of ranch work. She thought about the quality of her name in his voice. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "Same as before, you will work for your keep. I do not have wages to offer." "I do not need wages," he said. "I have some savings from the Fort Stockton hiring." "Then we have an arrangement," she said. He stayed, and the days took on a shape that Grace had not anticipated. She had expected him to be in the way. She had expected the particular kind of interference that well-meaning people often created on her land, moving things she needed to stay in place, offering unnecessary assistance, treating her constant competence as a performance to be applauded rather than simply a fact of her life. She had expected to spend energy correcting and redirecting. Instead, Peter Trask watched. He watched without staring. She could feel the difference, and he learned. Within 3 days, he had learned not to move her tools from their assigned spots. Within a week, he had learned that she navigated by the physical map she had built in her mind, and that the worst thing he could do was change that map by relocating anything without telling her first. When he fixed the barn roof, he told her exactly where he had put each new board, what nails he had used, what had changed. When he replaced the northwest fence post, he told her the height, the depth, the distance from the adjacent post. She found herself explaining her system to him, the way she had never really explained it to anyone, not even Robert, because Robert had arrived after she had already built it and had simply adapted to it as naturally as everything else. She told Peter about the rope guide she had strung at waist height from the house to the barn, and why, because in snowstorms or fog, the visual landmarks she relied on from sound and smell became confused, and the rope was a certainty. She told him about the notches she had cut into all the food containers in the kitchen, so she could distinguish them by touch. She told him about the system of bells at the gates, a single bell at the south gate, 2 at the north, 3 at the east where the main road ran, so she could tell immediately which direction any visitor was approaching from. Peter listened to all of this with an attention that felt rare and specific and rather wonderful, and he did not say she was remarkable or brave or any of the words that people offered her like coins for a beggar. He said, "That is very elegant," about the container notching system, which was not what people usually said but was, she thought, exactly right. They ate dinner together every night. He cooked sometimes, not as well as her but competently, and he did not apologize for it, which she appreciated. They talked through the long November evenings with the wind coming down from the north, and the stove putting out heat, and the oil lamp she kept burning more for the convention of it than for any personal necessity. She liked the smell of the lamp oil. She liked that the light was there even if she could not see it. He told her about Kansas, about growing up on a farm that had been marginal at best and gone bankrupt during a drought when he was 15. He told her about the years after that, which he described without self-pity but also without false cheer, as simply a string of hard years that had made him capable of most things. He had driven cattle and broken horses and dug wells, and helped build 2 different rail station outbuildings, and worked a short, miserable stretch in a silver mine in Colorado that had convinced him permanently that he was a man meant to be outdoors. She told him about being blind, not the way she usually told it, which was matter-of-fact and bounded, a recitation of facts to get the conversation past the awkward part and onto more interesting territory, but in more detail, in the interior detail that she rarely shared. She told him about the months after the fever, the utter darkness that had been terrifying at first and then had slowly become her normal. She told him about the school in Austin where her family had sent her, the Texas Institute for the Blind, which had been founded before the war and had survived it, and provided her with an education she was grateful for, though it had been a hard thing to be sent away from her family at 9, even for something good. She told him about the reading. She could read Braille, which the school had taught her from the embossed books they used, and she had a small collection of Braille texts that she kept in the bedroom and read by lamplight like everyone else, just by touch instead of sight. "Could I see one?" Peter asked one evening. "One of the books?" She brought out her copy of a collection of poetry she particularly loved, and she opened it and placed it on the table between them, and she listened to the sound of him running his fingertips over the raised dots the way she imagined a person who had never seen a foreign language must feel encountering its alphabet, curious, a little humbled by the intricacy of it. "It is like a secret," he said quietly. "Not a secret that excludes, more like a language you learn that opens something up." "That is exactly what it is," Grace said. He looked up from the book. She felt the direction of his attention shift from the book to her face, and the shift had a specific quality to it, a weight and warmth that she had been feeling more and more during these November evenings and that she had been carefully not naming, the way you do not name a fire until you are certain you want it to keep burning. "Grace," he said. "Yes. I want to say something, and I want to say it honestly, without any pretense." She set her hands flat on the table, a steadying gesture. "All right," she said. "I came back here because I wanted to see you again," he said. "Not because I needed a place to stay through the winter. Not entirely. I thought about you the whole 6 weeks I was in Fort Stockton, and I know we have only known each other a short time, but I find I cannot be in your company without feeling that the world is a better arranged place than I usually think it is. And I am telling you this directly because I think you are a person who prefers directness." Silence. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar. "You are correct that I prefer directness," Grace said. Her voice was steady. Inside, she was not steady, but her voice was, because she had had 20 years of keeping her voice steady when her insides were not. "And," he said, "and," she said, she breathed, "and I thought about you also." During those 6 weeks, the silence that followed was a completely different quality from any silence she had catalogued before. It was full rather than empty, the silence of two people occupying the same space in a new way. "Then I am glad I came back through this way," he said very softly. "So am I," she said. He did not try to take her hand that night, and she was both relieved and disappointed, and she lay in her bed later and was honest with herself about the disappointment. Winter came seriously in December, a cold snap that pushed down from the north and glazed the creek with ice and made the cattle stupid and plaintive with it. Grace and Peter worked together against the cold, breaking ice on the water troughs every morning, moving the horses into the barn at night, checking fence lines in the bitter wind to make sure none of the longhorns had pushed through looking for shelter. They worked well together in the cold, which she took as a good sign. You learned more about a person in adversity than in comfort. One morning in mid-December, she was at the North Trough with the axe breaking ice, and Peter was working at the far end of the fence line. And she heard the horses start in the barn, not the small, restless movements of cold, but the alarmed, high-stepping noise of horses that had detected a predator. She set the axe down and listened, and she smelled it a moment later, the rank, oily musk that meant mountain lion. She was already moving toward the barn when Peter came running from the fence line. "There is a cat," he said. "In the cedar on the north ridge I saw it move." "I know," Grace said. She was already past him, hand brushing the rope guide in the dark morning, moving for the rifle she kept just inside the barn door. "Stay close to the house." Grace, she had the rifle and she had positioned herself at the barn door and she was listening. The horses were inside and the door was closed. The cat would not get to them easily. The question was whether it was hungry enough to be aggressive about it. "It is moving east along the ridge," Peter said from behind her. His voice was steady, which she appreciated, "paralleling us. Now it is stopping." She tracked his voice, used it as a compass for where the cat was relative to her. She raised the rifle toward the ridge line, toward where his voice had described it stopping. "It is watching us," Peter said. "Good," Grace said. "Let it watch." She fired once into the cedar above where he had described the cat, not at it but near it, the way you fire to move an animal on rather than engage with it. The horses screamed briefly and then subsided. There was a crashing in the cedar that moved rapidly east and then faded. "It is gone," Peter said. Grace lowered the rifle. "You aimed that by my voice," Peter said. "You placed it for me," she said. "That was good description." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him turn to face her fully, and she felt the particular intensity of his attention that she had come to know over the past weeks. "Grace," he said, and she heard in her name something that was not going to be about mountain lions. "Peter," she said. "I would like to, may I?" He stopped, and she heard him make the decision, heard the resolution of it, and then she felt his hand, his right hand, reach out and find her left hand with a careful, questioning gentleness. His fingers closed around hers, and his hand was warm against the bitter cold and rough from decades of working outdoors. And she stood there in the gray winter morning with the smell of gun smoke and cedar and his particular warmth, and she did not pull away. She turned her hand in his and held it back. They stood like that for a while, outside the barn with the horses settling behind them and the winter dawn arriving in what she imagined was a wash of pale blue and gray, and nothing was said, because nothing needed to be. The weeks that followed had the quality of something she had given up expecting. She had not been unhappy in her solitude. She had chosen it, had built it into a life she was proud of, had furnished it with competence and purpose, and the particular satisfaction of knowing that she did not need anyone to survive. But there was, she discovered, a considerable distance between not needing anyone and not wanting anyone, and Peter Trask had crossed that distance with the same unhurried care with which he had learned the layout of her kitchen. They walked the land together. This was not something she had planned, but he asked one morning if she would show him the property, not with reluctance or condescension in the asking, but with genuine curiosity, the way one person asks another to show them something they love. And she had said yes, and they had spent the better part of a day walking every acre of the Hadley spread. She showed him the way she had always navigated it, walking him through her internal geography, the drainage ditch that ran northeast to southwest in the back pasture, and that she could hear when it held water, the flat limestone shelf along the creek where she sat sometimes in the afternoons to hear the water, the enormous live oak in the center of the south pasture that she could smell from 100 yards when it was green, and had learned to smell even in winter, a faint dry sweetness that nothing else smelled like. She showed him the fence markers she had tied with different materials, wool at the north corners, cotton at the south, rough or hemp at the gates, so she could tell by touch which corner of the property she was at. Peter was quiet through all of this with the specific quality of quiet that meant he was memorizing everything she said, absorbing it. He asked careful questions, the kind that told her he was thinking about the system rather than being politely indulgent. "What about weather?" he said. "Bad weather, I mean a real storm, not just rain." "The hardest thing is heavy snow," she said. "It changes the acoustic landscape. It muffles sounds I rely on. It covers the landmarks I can feel, the stones, the fence line differences. I stay close to the house in real snow. I have lost my bearings twice in heavy snow, and it is not something I intend to repeat." "What happened?" he asked, without alarm, just attention. "The first time I walked into the creek before I realized how far I had gone from the house," she said. "The second time I found my way by the smell of the stove smoke. I turned in the direction of the smoke and walked toward it." She paused. "I have since put a longer rope guide. It goes all the way to the south pasture gate now." "That is a 1/4 mile," Peter said. "It is," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said carefully, "I am glad you figured it out, the smoke navigation." "So am I," she said dryly. He laughed, and she loved the way he laughed, the easy genuineness of it. They were standing at the creek then, at the flat limestone shelf, and the December sun was low, and she could feel its warmth on the left side of her face, which meant it was past noon, moving toward mid-afternoon. The creek ran very low in winter, a thin sound over the stones. She heard Peter sit down on the limestone shelf beside her, close enough that the warmth of him added to the winter sun's warmth. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You are asking a great many things today," she said. "I know," he said. "You do not have to answer any of them." She sat down beside him on the limestone. "Ask," she said. "When you knew Robert," he said carefully, "when you married him and came here, were you happy?" She thought about this. Not the hasty version of the answer, but the real one. "Yes," she said. He was a good man and I was very fond of him. I would not say it was, she stopped, chosen her words. I would not say it was this. But I was content and I respected him and I believe he felt the same. This, Peter repeated. I should not have said that, she said. I am very glad you did, he said. She felt him turn toward her, and she turned toward him because she knew the direction of him the way she knew the direction of everything on her land, by long attention, and a knowledge that had become instinct. And he kissed her, quietly and without drama, just his mouth against hers in the cold air, warm and certain, and she kissed him back. And the creek ran very quietly over the limestone below them, and the winter sun continued its slow business in the west. When they pulled apart, she was sitting very still with her hands in her lap, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she had not been for a very long time. "Grace," he said. She said, which was not much of a response but was the best she could manage in the moment. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If that is all right." She turned this over. Proper courtship in 1883 in rural Texas meant a certain set of conventions, some of which she appreciated and some of which she found tedious, but beneath the conventions was the genuine substance of what he was asking, which was whether she would allow him to pursue this in earnest. "The job at Fort Stockton," she said. "You start in spring." "Yes," he said. "Fort Stockton is a day's ride. It is not across a continent." "No," he said, "it is not." "Then I suppose we have some time to figure things out," she said. "I suppose we do," he said. The courtship, as it developed over the remaining winter weeks, had its own particular character, shaped partly by convention and partly by who they each were. He brought her things he found on the land, a piece of quartz he had noticed because of how it caught light, which he described to her with some care, a bird's feather, smooth and stiff in her fingers, a fragment of pottery he had turned up near the old Comanche trail that she ran her thumbs across and recognized as something old and carefully made. She did not tell him she could not see the quartz shine. She ran it between her fingers and felt its cool weight and smooth facets, and understood from that what there was to understand. She read to him in the evenings from her Braille books, translating with her fingers and her voice, and he listened with the quality of attention she had come to know as specific to him. She read him poetry. She read him a chapter from a history of Texas she had received from the Austin school before she left. He listened to all of it with equal attentiveness, which told her something about him. January brought a week of hard freeze that pushed even the cattle into the barn at night and left the water pump seized each morning. They worked together in the brutal cold, and in the working together they became more fully themselves to each other. She saw, in the way she saw things, how he moved through difficulty without complaint and without false heroics, just doing what needed doing with a steady competence that matched her own. He saw her in her full ability, and she felt this without doubt. There was no performance in his attention, no careful overlooking of her blindness, no anxious watching for failure. He watched her the way you watch someone you trust. One evening in late January, a neighbor came to call Hedda Morse, who farmed the adjacent property 2 miles west with her husband Cal, and who had been Grace's closest acquaintance since Robert died. Hedda was a direct woman in her 40s who had been kind to Grace without ever being condescending, which was a rare combination, and Grace valued her accordingly. Hedda arrived, came in, had coffee, and was politely and extremely interested in Peter Trask. After Peter excused himself to see to the horses, Hedda leaned across the table and said, in a quieter version of her regular direct voice, "Grace Hadley, who is that man?" "He is working through the winter," Grace said. "He is looking at you," Hedda said, "in a way that is not how a hired hand looks at an employer." "He is not exactly a hired hand," Grace said. "And we are, that is, you are keeping company," Hedda said. "We are keeping company," Grace agreed. Hedda was quiet for a moment. Grace waited for what would come next because with Hedda something always came next. "Does he know?" Hedda started. "Yes," Grace said. "And he does not," Grace said. "Good," Hedda said with a kind of fierce satisfaction. "Good for him and good for you." She was quiet again for a moment, and then she said more gently, "You deserve this, Grace. After everything, you deserve someone who sees you right." Grace wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "He does not see me," she said, the dry humor she sometimes used to deflect sentiment. "You know what I mean," Hedda said. "I do," Grace said. "I know what you mean." Peter came back in, and Hedda stayed another hour and included him in conversation with the comfortable efficiency of someone deciding to approve of a person and getting on with it. When she left, she pressed Grace's hand at the door and said nothing, which was its own kind of eloquence. In February, Grace's old friend and sometime supplier Josiah Kane came out from Clover Creek with a wagon load of goods. She had ordered flour and salt and oil and a new axe head, and she introduced Peter to him as well. Josiah was a taciturn man who had run the general store in Clover Creek for 15 years, and who had always dealt with Grace with the same brisk fairness he dealt with everyone, which she had valued from the beginning. He shook Peter's hand with the particular wariness of a man assessing another man's intentions, and Peter met it with an openness that Grace could hear. No bluster, no performance, and by the time Josiah had his wagon unloaded, there seemed to be an understanding of some kind. As Josiah was leaving, he said to Peter, "You take care of this place and this woman. She built something here worth taking care of." Peter said, "I know it." Josiah said, "Good," and left. Peter came back to the porch where Grace was standing and said, "I feel I have just been vetted." "You have been," she said, "by everyone in a 20-mile radius from the sound of it." "Perhaps," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "No, I think it is the right thing. You should be," he searched for the word, "protected. Not because you need protecting, because you matter." She did not have an immediate answer for that, so she stood there on the porch in the February cold and felt the sun, still winter pale, on her upturned face, and she thought about the word matter and the weight of it. Spring came in stages, the way it always did in that country, tentative and then sudden, the scrub going green and the creek running up, and the mockingbirds arriving from wherever mockingbirds went in winter, filling the mornings with their layered, complicated singing. Peter's start date at Fort Stockton was the 1st of April, and as March moved along there was a conversation they were both having slowly and from different angles without quite arriving at the center of it. Grace was aware of the approaching date the way she was aware of changes in weather, in the quality of his silences, in a certain care he was taking in how he spoke, as if choosing his words more deliberately. On a warm afternoon in mid-March, they were sitting in the kitchen with coffee, and the south door open to the new spring air. Grace could smell the early bluebonnets coming up along the creek path and the particular green warm smell of the cedar waking up, and she was thinking about nothing in particular, just sitting in the warmth, when Peter set his cup down with a small deliberate sound and said, "Grace." "Yes," she said. "I need to say something," he said. "I know," she said. He paused. "You know what I am going to say." "I have a reasonable guess," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I do not want to go to Fort Stockton and leave you here and come back on visits and have this. I do not want what we have to be a visiting situation. I want to ask you something more than that. But I need to ask you honestly and with full understanding of what I am asking." "All right," she said. "You have built this place yourself," he said. "You have built it without help and without anyone telling you what to do or how to do it, and it is yours in every way that a thing can be a person's. I do not want to come in and change that. I do not want to be the kind of husband who, the word husband is what I am getting to, I realize." "I did realize that, yes," Grace said. "Grace Hadley," he said, "I am asking you to marry me. I am asking you plainly. I am not asking you because you need help, because you clearly do not. And I am not asking you because I feel sorry for you, because there is nothing to feel sorry about. I am asking you because I have not been happy the way I have been happy this winter for possibly ever, and I think you are the most capable and remarkable," and he stopped himself. "I think you are the best person I have ever met, and I would like to spend the rest of my life on this land with you, if you will have me." The mockingbirds were very loud in the yard. The spring air came through the open door with the smell of new grass and distance. "Fort Stockton," Grace said. "Fort Stockton is manageable," he said. "I can negotiate the terms. They need me, but not so desperately that they cannot accommodate a man who lives on his own land and rides in on the days they need him. Or we can discuss it. Everything is discussable." "Everything is discussable," she repeated. "Is that a yes?" he said. Grace breathed in the spring air. She thought about the years she had spent learning to do everything herself, learning to need no one, and she thought about how that had been not a limitation but a preparation for this, for being able to choose freely rather than from necessity, for being able to say yes to a person because she wanted them and not because she needed them. She thought about the quality of the winter just past, the cold and the work and the evenings and the creek shelf in December and the January hard freeze and the way he had learned her world without trying to change it. "Yes," she said. "That is a yes." He made a sound that was not quite a word, and she felt rather than heard him move. And then he was beside her and his arms were around her, careful and then not careful, and she held on to him with both hands in the spring air, and the mockingbirds continued their performance outside without any acknowledgement of the event, which she thought was exactly right. They were married in late April at the Clover Creek Baptist Church, which was a small limestone building not unlike her house, and which was full despite its size because word had traveled the way word travels in small communities, completely and with embellishment. Hedda Morse was there, and Josiah Kane, and Cal Morse, and the Red Horse family from the small community 5 miles east, and the pastor, Reverend Aldridge, who was a reasonable man who had married 4 couples and buried 6 people in his 4 years in Clover Creek, and who conducted the ceremony with a simple dignity that Grace appreciated. She wore a dress she had made herself the previous winter. She had asked Hedda to describe the blue wool fabric as she worked with it, because she wanted to know the color of it even though she could not see it, and Hedda had said it was the blue of a late afternoon sky in October, which Grace found she could hold in her mind like a piece of music. She walked down the short aisle with her hand lightly on Josiah's arm, not because she could not walk unassisted, but because that was the convention, and she respected Josiah enough to let him have it. Peter was waiting at the front of the church, and she knew this not by sight but by the specific quality of his presence, which she had by now memorized as thoroughly as her land, the particular warmth and slight sound, and the way the air around him felt when he was focused completely on her. Reverend Aldridge read from Ruth, the book about loyalty and belonging to a new land, which Grace thought was well chosen. When Peter said his vows, his voice was steady and clear, and she heard no hesitation in it, nothing held back, which was how he said everything he meant. When she said her vows, she said them without looking down or away. Her gray eyes aimed forward in the way they always were, and her voice was steady too, and she meant every word with the full weight of 20 years of learning to be honest about what she felt. They had the reception at Hedda's house, which was larger than the church, and there was food and a fiddle player named Denny Alcott who had been playing at Clover Creek celebrations since before the town had a name, and there was dancing, which Grace did not avoid. She had danced at her first wedding, and she danced at this one, with Peter's hand at the small of her back and his voice at her ear telling her quietly which way they were turning, and she followed him with the ease of someone who has learned to trust a guide who never leads you wrong. Spring turned to summer, and the Hadley spread, which was beginning, by degrees and without ceremony, to be called the Trask place by some of their neighbors, though Grace kept the name Hadley on the deed and the gate post, and in her own head, the way you keep something that has earned its keeping settled into the rhythms of a 2-person operation, which were quite different from the rhythms of one. Peter negotiated with the Fort Stockton operation as he had said, settling on an arrangement where he would spend 2 days per week at the cattle operation, which lay a full day's ride south, and the rest of his time at the ranch. It was not a perfect arrangement, but it was workable, and he was home far more than he was away, which suited them both. In the summer, the work was intense haying the south pasture, maintaining the water supply through the dry months, managing the cattle through the heat. They worked side by side with the ease of people who have thoroughly learned each other's rhythms, who know when to work in comfortable silence and when to talk, who have developed the shared shorthand of people building something together. Grace taught Peter more of her system, more of the deep, detailed knowledge of the land that she had accumulated over 4 years. She taught him what she knew about the seasonal changes in the creek, about the specific places where the fence was vulnerable in hard rain, about the signs she read in sound and smell that told her when the weather was changing. He listened and learned and added his own observations, the ones that came from sight, the way the sky looked before a storm, the exact coloration of the cattle when they were healthy versus when something was off. They built between them a knowledge of the land that was deeper than either of them had alone, and Grace found this deeply satisfying, this particular kind of addition. In August, Grace knew before she told Peter. She knew with the specific, interior certainty of a body that has been a reliable source of information for 20 years, that she was expecting a child. She told him on a hot evening on the porch after the sun had gone down enough that the heat was bearable and the night sounds had started, the crickets and the distant cattle and the creek. She said it plainly the way she said things. "I am expecting a child." Peter was quiet for a long moment. She could hear his breathing change the way it changed when something large was happening inside him. "Grace," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" he started. "I am well," she said. "I am healthy and I have been healthy my whole life, and I have no reason to expect otherwise." She paused. "I am also aware that childbirth is not without risk and that I will need to make arrangements for care, and I intend to be practical about that." "Yes," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man trying to be practical while everything emotional in him was doing something else entirely. "Yes, of course. We will find there is a midwife in Clover Creek," Grace said. "Mrs. Fay Buckner. She has delivered a great many babies in this county. Hetta thinks well of her." "Then we will talk to Mrs. Buckner," Peter said. And then he said more quietly, the practical scaffolding falling away, "Grace, we are going to have a child." "We are," she said. She heard him get up from his chair and she felt him crouch down beside hers, and he took both her hands in both of his. His hands were warm and she could feel his pulse in them, or maybe that was her own pulse. "I am so glad," he said. "I am so very glad." "So am I," she said, and meant it completely. Mrs. Buckner was a brisk, capable woman in her 50s who had been delivering babies in Clover Creek since 1871, and who met Grace's blindness with no more fuss than if she had been left-handed. She came out to the ranch in September to make Grace's acquaintance and assess the situation, and she and Grace spoke frankly about everything that needed to be spoken about, and by the end of it Mrs. Buckner said, "You will do well. You are not a woman who is easily frightened by her own body, which is the most important thing." "No," Grace agreed. "I am not." The autumn of 1884 settled into the ranch with a particular richness that Grace noticed in the way she noticed everything through texture and sound and the quality of time. She was larger as autumn progressed, which changed her navigation somewhat. She walked more carefully, recalibrated her internal maps for her changed center of gravity, told Peter when he needed to stay close on the rough terrain. He stayed close when she asked and gave her space when she did not, which was exactly the balance she needed. He read to her in the evenings, which she had not expected. She had been the one reading aloud, since she had the Braille books, but he had bought a novel from Josiah Kane's store in Clover Creek, and he read to her from it on the evenings when she was tired, his voice moving through the story with the same easy attentiveness he brought to everything. And she would lie on the settee with her feet up and one hand on her growing middle and listen to the story, and to the quality of his voice telling it. And she felt a contentment so deep it was almost a physical thing. In November, on a cold, clear evening that Grace could identify by the specific, clean quality of the cold, The star-quality cold, she called it privately. The kind that had no moisture in it, just sheer clear winter air. She felt the first signs that the baby was coming, and Peter went immediately for Mrs. Buckner, while Grace went through the things she needed to do in the house with calm, methodical efficiency. It was a long night. Mrs. Buckner arrived within 2 hours, and she was calm and competent and told Grace when to rest and when to work. And Grace applied herself to the whole business with the same focused attention she gave to everything difficult. Peter was in the house because Grace had told him plainly that she wanted him in the house, not pacing the barn like some theatrical gesture. He sat in the kitchen and he was there when she needed him, available and close, and she found this more comforting than she would have predicted. At 4 in the morning, in the deep dark of the November night, Grace Hadley Trask's son was born. He was healthy and loud, and Mrs. Buckner put him in Grace's arms, and Grace ran her fingers over every inch of him, with a thoroughness and delicacy that moved Mrs. Buckner later to describe to her sister as the most careful examination of a newborn she had ever witnessed, as if that mother was reading her son the way she read her books, by touch, by the reality of him under her hands. Peter, who had come in when Mrs. Buckner called him, stood by the bed, and Grace heard the sound he made when he saw his son and held him, a sound not quite language, the kind of sound that happens below the level of language, and she was glad she could hear it. "What do you want to name him?" she said. Peter was quiet, looking at the baby. "What do you want?" "Robert," she said, "for the middle name, if that is all right." "Robert," Peter said. "Yes." "That is more than all right." He was quiet. "James," he said. "My father's name, James Robert Trask." "James Robert Trask," Grace said. The baby found her finger and held it with the blind determination of the newborn, all grip and demand, and she felt the weight and warmth of him, and thought that she had built many things in her life, had mapped and memorized and constructed and maintained, had built a ranch from grief and a life from blindness, and a marriage from an October afternoon, and a stranger's desperate footsteps in a dry creek bed. She thought that this was, of all of it, the most astonishing thing she had ever made. James Robert Trask was 7 weeks old on Christmas Day 1884, and on that day, which Grace identified by the particular smell of the pine boughs Hedda had brought over to decorate with, and the cold that had a special December character, thick and still, she sat in the kitchen chair with James at her breast and Peter across from her, and she thought about the previous Christmas, which had been just the two of them and a snowstorm and the particular warmth of being caught by weather with the right person. "What are you thinking about?" Peter said. "Last Christmas," she said. "A year ago we had known each other 2 months," he said. "Yes," she said. "And now," he said. "And now," she agreed. James made a small, comfortable sound against her. "Are you happy?" Peter asked. He asked it directly, the way he asked everything. She thought about the question with her usual seriousness because it deserved seriousness. She thought about her life, the ranch, which was thriving, the cattle herd grown to 11 now, 2 new foals in the spring, the barn fully repaired, a second small room added onto the house over the summer in preparation for the baby. She thought about her mornings, which began in the dark before dawn and were full and purposeful and rich in the things she loved, the sound of her land, the smell of the cedar and the creek, the work that she was good at, the life she had built from what others had written off as impossible. She thought about Peter, who had arrived like a lost thing and turned out to be exactly where he was supposed to be. She thought about James, small and solid and fierce in her arms, who had arrived in the world already seeming to have opinions about it, and whom she knew by the weight and smell and sound of him with a completeness she had not imagined possible. "I am happy," she said. "Genuinely." Not contentedly, genuinely. "Good," he said. "I am also genuinely happy." "I know," she said. "You know everything," he said warmly. "I know this land," she said. "I know you. I know our son. I know this house. That is enough to know." The new year of 1885 came in and the ranch kept its rhythms and James grew with the determined speed of healthy babies, and the months moved as months do in places where the work is real, and the seasons are definite and the days are full. By spring, James was holding his own head up and regarding the world with great intensity, and Grace would take him out in the mornings, wrapped against the last of the cool air, and walk the property with him, narrating everything to him the way she had always narrated things in her head. The sound of the creek, the smell of the cedar, the warmth of the morning sun. She told him the names of what the wind sounded like in different weather, the way the cattle sounded at different times of day, the information contained in the smell of rain on dry ground. Peter came with them sometimes on these morning walks, and he would add to her narration the things she could not tell James: the color of the spring flowers coming up in the south pasture, the exact way the light looked on the limestone in the morning. They built a picture for their son that was layered and complete, assembled from the full range of how the world could be known. Hedda, Morse, and Cal came to dinner one evening in March, and Hedda held James for an entire hour and argued with Grace about whether he looked more like Peter or like a Hadley, and Grace said she had no opinion because she had never seen either Peter or herself, which made Peter laugh so hard he nearly upset his coffee. "That is not fair," Hedda said. "It is exactly fair," Grace said. "Tell me what he feels like, that I can work with." "He feels like a person who is going to be trouble," Hedda said, bouncing James with practiced authority. "His parents are both stubborn," Peter offered. "Extraordinarily stubborn," Grace agreed. "Then he will be fine," Hedda said. In the summer of 1885, the Fort Stockton arrangement came up for renegotiation. The operation had expanded, and they wanted more of Peter's time. He came home from Fort Stockton in June and sat down with Grace and laid out the situation plainly, as he always did, because that was how they worked, every decision made together, both voices equal, no conclusions reached without the other. "They want me 4 days a week," he said. "That is too many days away," Grace said. "I agree," he said. "I told them as much. They offered an alternative. They want me to manage a subsidiary operation. 15 head they would run on our land on the south pasture with full feed and veterinary cost covered by them. I would manage both herds. No commuting." Grace was quiet for a moment. 15 head on the south pasture," she said. "The grazing is sufficient in wet years. In dry years we would need to negotiate water access." "I have already drafted the terms," Peter said, "including water provisions for drought years. I wanted to have something concrete before I brought it to you." "Show me," she said. He read the terms aloud carefully, every clause. She listened with her full attention and asked 3 questions, 2 of which he had already anticipated and 1 of which he had not, and they spent an hour working through the details and refining the language, and at the end she said, "Send the revised terms. I think it can work." "So do I," he said. The arrangement with Fort Stockton began in August and proved sensible, good income, manageable work. No more long absences. Peter was home every day, which was what they both wanted. In the autumn, Grace turned 29, and Peter made her a gift that she had not expected. He had commissioned from a craftsman in Fort Stockton a new Braille book, a novel she had mentioned wanting, and which was unavailable from her usual source in Austin. The craftsman was a retired teacher who had connections to the Texas Institute for the Blind, and the book arrived in October, pressed and clean, and Grace ran her fingers over the cover with an expression on her face that Peter later told Hedda was the face of a person receiving exactly the right thing. "How did you know to do that?" Hedda asked him. "She told me she wanted it," Peter said simply. "I just listened." Hedda told this to Cal, who told Josiah, who mentioned it to the next customer at the store, and it moved through Clover Creek with the quiet velocity of small-town good news. October moved into November and November into December, and 1885 closed with the ranch profitable and the cattle healthy and James walking unsteadily, furiously, refusing all assistance around the perimeter of the kitchen, and Grace and Peter on the porch in the December evening, their breath making visible shapes in the cold air, listening to the quiet of the land they had together built a life on. "Next year," Peter said. "Next year what?" Grace said. "I am thinking about adding another room," he said. "On the south side." "Why the south side?" she said. "Better light," he said, and then caught himself with a small rueful exhale. "Better warmth," she said. "You mean better warmth in winter. The south side gets more winter sun." "Yes," he said, "better warmth." "That is a good reason," she said. "I thought so," he said. She leaned against him. They were standing at the porch rail, shoulder to shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and she felt the familiar comfort of him, the solid reality of this life. Inside the house, James was asleep. The cattle were settled in the pasture, 10 of them now plus the 15 from Fort Stockton, a thriving herd that she tracked by sound and count every day. The barn was solid, the roof repaired, the water pump maintained and reliable. The kitchen garden would go back in come March. The south pasture fence was good through winter. She had built this, all of it. She had built the first version alone, from grief and determination and the absolute refusal to be told she could not. She had built the second version with Peter, from choice and love, and the peculiar deep satisfaction of doing difficult things with someone who understood them as well as you did. She thought about October of 1883, a lost cowboy crunching through her creek bed with his thirsty horse, and the rifle she had aimed at the sound and the instinct that had made her lower it. "Peter," she said. "Yes." "I am glad you got lost," she said. He pulled her closer. "So am I," he said. "Every day." The stars were very bright over the Texas scrubland, and the creek ran quietly below the limestone shelf where they had first kissed, and the cedar breathed its specific dark sweetness into the cold air, and the bells at the north gate rang once softly as the wind moved through them, and then the night was very still. In the spring of 1886, Grace discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was, as she had predicted with characteristic practicality, similar in most respects to the first. She was well, she was healthy. She modified her work to accommodate the changes in her body with the same methodical competence she brought to all adaptation. Peter worried more than she did, which she found both touching and mildly unnecessary, and she told him so, which he accepted with the good humor of someone who knows they are being slightly irrational. Mrs. Buckner came out regularly through the summer and fall, and on a November morning, a full year after James's birth, almost to the week, Grace delivered a daughter. She was smaller than James had been and quieter, arriving in the early dawn and immediately looking around at the world with an expression that Grace could not see, but that Peter described as a person arriving somewhere they fully intended to be. "Clara," Grace said, running her fingers over the tiny face, the small hands, the fine hair still damp from birth. "Clara," Peter said, from where he stood by the bed holding James, who had woken at the commotion, and was regarding his sister with the scientific curiosity of a very young person encountering something new and unprecedented. "Clara Me Trask," Grace said. Me had been her mother's name, her mother who had held her through the long dark fever of 1863, who had never stopped treating her as a whole person after the darkness settled. "Clara Me," Peter said. James said something that was not quite a word but was clearly in the direction of approval. The house that winter was full in the way that houses are full when they hold both the noise of a healthy toddler and the particular sounds of a newborn, which Grace navigated with her usual equanimity, tracking both children by sound with a completeness that sometimes astonished the visitors who came in those months. "Hedda and Cal, Josiah," Mrs. Buckner checking in. Grace knew by the quality of James's silence when he was getting into something he should not be, and by the quality of Clara's breathing when she was deep asleep versus when she was about to wake. And she moved through the Fuller house with the same competent authority with which she had always moved through her world, recalibrated for new data. Peter added the south room that spring as planned, and the house grew into something that felt fully inhabited, fully itself, walls full of the accumulated life of people who had chosen each other and chosen this land. The years settled into what Grace would have described as a kind of abundance, had someone asked her. The ranch continued to do well under the arrangement with Fort Stockton, and under their own careful management. James grew into a fierce, curious child who had his mother's stubbornness and his father's easy warmth, and who learned very early that his mother knew where he was and what he was doing at all times, which initially frustrated him and eventually became something he took a quiet pride in. Clara was different, more observational, more given to watching and gathering information before acting, and she and Grace developed a particular closeness that had its own character, a shared quality of paying attention to the world rather than simply moving through it. In 1888, by which time James was 3 and Clara was nearly 2, Josiah Kane's store in Clover Creek had grown enough that he hired a second person, and the town itself added a doctor, a young man named Dr. Marcus Webb from Dallas, who had come west for his health and stayed for lack of better options, which was how many people ended up in places they came to love. Dr. Webb met Grace at Josiah's store one afternoon, and was in the middle of being carefully not condescending when Grace, who could detect condescension at 40 paces, preempted whatever he was about to say by telling him exactly which medicinal herbs she grew in the kitchen garden and precisely what she used them for, and that if he wanted to consult on any local cases involving fever management, she had considerably more experience than average. Dr. Webb, who was a decent man, laughed with genuine delight and said that yes, he absolutely would consult her, and that was the beginning of a professional acquaintance that proved useful to both of them. The Texas of 1888 was a Texas that was changing rapidly, the frontier closing the way the newspapers in Dallas and Austin were beginning to say it was, the last of the Comanche fully on the reservations, the big cattle drives winding down as the rail lines came in and made the long drives unnecessary, fences going up across the open range that had been open for generations of use. Grace followed these changes by what she heard, in the conversations at Josiah's store, and in what Peter and the others described of the physical landscape, the new fences appearing on horizons that had been unbroken, the railroad tracks laid through Clover Creek in 1887, that she had felt as a vibration in the ground before she heard the train, and that now provided a bi-weekly connection to the wider world. She thought sometimes about the injustice of the land's history, the Comanche Trail in her southwest corner, worn into the caliche by generations of people who had been here long before anyone named Hadley or Trask, who had been moved and contained and stripped of the very land knowledge that she, in her own way, understood the value of. She thought about old Samuel, who had told her about that trail years ago, and she kept it clear and respected it as she always had, for reasons she could not have fully explained, but that had something to do with the understanding that land has memory, and that memory deserves acknowledgement. She mentioned this to Peter one evening, and he listened, as he always did, and he said he thought she was right, and he had said similar things in conversation with some of the other ranchers, who had received the sentiment with varying degrees of reception. Grace did not expect to change the world by thinking carefully about it, but she did not intend to stop thinking carefully about it either. Spring of 1889 brought another negotiation with Fort Stockton. The operation was being bought out by a larger concern from Austin, and Peter and Grace had decisions to make about whether to continue the arrangement or go fully independent. They talked it through over several evenings, with the care and mutual respect that characterized all their decisions, and in the end they concluded that independence suited them better. They had the herd, they had the land, they had enough connections through Josiah and through the new rail connection to sell cattle without an intermediary arrangement. Peter gave his notice to Fort Stockton and came home full-time, and the ranch became entirely what it had always been in essence, theirs. The summer of 1889 was a dry one, the kind of summer that tested ranches, the creek running low, the pasture going brown earlier than it should, the cattle restless with the heat. Grace and Peter managed it with the combination of her deep knowledge of the land's water sources and his physical ability to extend and maintain the infrastructure. He dug a second water storage cistern behind the barn, following her instructions about where the rock was softest and the runoff concentrated, and the cistern filled with the August rains and carried them through the rest of the dry season. The fall came cooler and wetter, and the pasture recovered and the cattle settled. And by the time October returned, Grace always felt October as a particular relief after summer, the air going sharp and clear, the world contracting back to its essential qualities. The ranch was well, and the family was well, and the life they had built had the particular solidity of something properly constructed. On the evening of October 15th, 1889, exactly 6 years after Peter Trask had ridden through the creek bed and announced himself with tired hoofbeats and the smell of a thirsty horse, Grace was sitting on the porch in the last of the evening light, which she felt as warmth on her face and a specific golden quality to the air temperature that she had learned over decades to associate with October, with the good kind of ending and beginning, with everything that she valued in the turning of a year. James was inside at the kitchen table working at his letters. He had started lessons with the schoolteacher in Clover Creek that fall, riding in with Peter on the days Peter took supplies to town. Clara was asleep already, early as she always was, finished with her day completely and without reservation. Peter was somewhere behind her. She could hear him at the wood pile, the rhythmic crack of splitting, a sound she associated with preparation and competence and the particular pleasure of having what you need. The mockingbirds were settling into their evening calling, and the creek was running well after the September rains, and she could smell the mesquite from the house fire and the dry cedar and the particular leather-and horse smell of the barn, and all of it was hers, all of it was known. All of it was fully mapped in the interior geography she had spent her entire life building. Peter came around from the wood pile. She heard him, and he came up the porch steps and sat in his chair beside her, and they sat in the comfortable silence that was one of their most common and most valued forms of communication. After a time he said, "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" "What?" she said. "The day I rode up to this house for the first time," he said. "You standing on the porch with that rifle. You were terrified," she said. "I was not terrified," he said. "I was extremely cautious." "You were terrified," she said. "A little terrified," he allowed. She smiled. "And what were you thinking about it?" "I was thinking that it is the best thing I have ever done," he said. "Getting lost, coming to that particular dry creek bed on that particular day." "You were miserable," she said. "Your horse was suffering. And then I met you," he said. "And then I had the best evening I had had in years. And I rode to Fort Stockton thinking about nothing but when I could reasonably come back." 6 weeks, she said. "You came back in 6 weeks. It felt like considerably longer," he said. She reached sideways from her chair and found his hand, which was where it always was, easy to find. She held it the way she had held it that first winter morning outside the barn, with the mountain lion in the cedar and the gun smoke and the cold, and he held hers back. "I am going to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I aimed that rifle at you," she said, "and then I heard you shift in the saddle and I heard the quality of your voice and I put the rifle down, and the reason I put the rifle down was not entirely because you sounded harmless." "No," he said. "The reason I put the rifle down," she said, "was because your voice sounded like a person I wanted to know." He was quiet for a moment. "You knew that from 30 seconds of conversation." "I knew it from the way you talked to your horse," she said. "You murmured to it when you were watering it. Not words, just sounds. The way a person talks to something they care about without thinking about whether anyone is watching." "You heard that from inside the house," he said. "I hear everything," she said. He tightened his hand around hers, and they sat on the porch in the October evening, the air going blue around them, the creek running, the cattle quiet in the pasture, the children inside in the lamplit house, the land fully themselves and fully known, the life they had built together holding everything they needed in it, complete and settled and rich as good ground, going on in all directions around them, all the way to the horizon they could not see and did not need to, because they already knew exactly where they were. Inside, James called something from the kitchen, some question about his letters that could not wait, and Clara made a sound from her room that was the sound of a person who was not quite as asleep as everyone thought, and Peter stood and said, "I will go." "I know," Grace said. She stayed on the porch another moment, one hand on the rough post Robert had cut and sanded, the air on her face, the October world speaking in all its particular languages around her. She heard Peter's voice inside, answering James with patience and good humor, and she heard Clara settle back into real sleep, and she heard the creek and the cedar and the cattle and the specific, known silence of the land at evening. Then she went inside, into the warm light and the noise and the life, and the door swung shut behind her, and the night settled quietly over the Hadley Trask place at Clover Creek, Texas, as it had done every night for 6 years now, with everything in order and everyone accounted for and no question left unanswered, the way a well-built thing rests easy in its rightful place.